Tuesday, 2nd July, 1861. We arrived in camp this evening. Aubrey and two other fellows met me at Professor Hudson's house. They went on a great drunk last night and showed up an hour late with their valises half open and trailing all manner of clothing behind them. The second hour we spent picking up after them over half the campus and wondering whether one could be sent directly to the guardhouse upon his first appearance in camp. The rest of the company was waiting at the dock and had refused to board the boat until their captain came. A great cheer went up among the men when Professor Hudson and his motley entourage arrived. I fear I shall have a hard time getting into the habit of calling our esteemed teacher Captain, as I have trouble remembering to put the title before his name even in writing. The commander of our vessel was a gruff, pitched-lipped man called Jarvis, though by looking at him one would suppose his name to be Methuselah. One of our men made the mistake of remarking on how well built the boat was. Methuselah retorted that this was no dinghy, his vessel was a ship. The small size of the ship hardly accounts for so flattering a distinction, but no one bothered to argue the point. The remainder of our crossing was uneventful. We arrived at Annapolis after 3 o'clock, and as the camp is little more than 7 miles northeast of the city, Captain Hudson ordered us to take the distance in the military style which we had all seen but never done, that is to say, marching. 98 men struggled to maintain rank and file while keeping step and time with the captain whose gait, I should say despite my great admiration for the man, was about as steady as that of a tottering old woman. We made between 2 and 4 miles an hour, depending on the captain, and came into Camp Carradine about 6 o'clock. I imagine we were a sight to the regulars. The camp is not visible from the road, as it lies behind a rise, so that when one comes upon it, the grand view is a shock. One moment a soldier has bare ground before his eyes, and the next he sees a mile or more filled with white canvas tents, like a regiment aligned perfectly for the march. Patches of green and brown break the monotony of the blank field. It looks like winter in Alabama, when the ground is just dusted with snow that cannot hide the frozen red clay or the dead brown grass that shoots up like spears. When I first saw it, I wanted to go stalking through, as I did as a boy, pretending to be Gulliver among the Lilliputians. I did not show that traveler's magnanimous nature, but enjoyed hearing the crunch of the grass-like buildings beneath my feet. If this smattering of snow had been real, a good many of us would have rejoiced at its refreshing sight on this July day. We were all miserably dusty and hot. The faces of the men were streaked brown and white, where droplets of water had dribbled down their faces and necks to wash tiny gullies in the accumulation of dust. These gullies were smeared by shirt sleeves and handkerchiefs, until each man looked more like a savage in war paint than the gentleman each knows himself to be. Aubrey and I accompanied Captain Hudson to Colonel Maxwell's tent, so we were not present for the taunts that our men were forced to endure. Their tormentors, the so-called veterans, entered this camp of instruction a mere 2 weeks ago. Had they seen an hour of fighting, I would not have been as indignant at the report of the men having been asked how many hours since they had been weaned from mother's teat, and so forth. Colonel Maxwell is quite short and spindly, with a nearly bald pate, the shape of which seems to denote a biting wit and a carefree approach to life. We seem to have caught him in an ill mood, however, as he did little more than point us in the direction of our new regiment, the 11th Maryland Volunteers. After another trek across camp, we found the regimental commander, Colonel Walden, in his quarters, sketching the scene from his tent's entrance. He's actually quite good. He left off his drawing when we announced ourselves to assign us quarters and give each a copy of Army Regulations. Captain Hudson additionally received a couple of volumes on battle tactics. We were told to memorize the content of these works tonight, as instruction of our company will commence tomorrow, in the belief that the best way to learn is to do. I have skimmed my copy of the regulations, and do not see how I shall learn all of them in a few hours. Captain Hudson will lead our first few drills, so Aubrey and I are safe for a while. Yet when drill duties are eventually relegated to us, I fear I shall make a spectacle of myself. I imagine this is the fear of every officer who must learn while he teaches. Dark blue frock coat with dark blue velvet collar and cuffs, black cravat, white gloves, crimson sash. Teague's dress uniform looked quite the picture of military finery as it lay across his bed. But when Teague had told Dr. Warner that he might have other clothes suitable for a wedding, he had thought he could force himself not to notice the sick feeling that came whenever he looked at the uniform. He swallowed and blew out slowly to rid himself of the nausea as he sat down beside it. He clenched his hands together until they stopped shaking, then pinned up the right leg of his trousers. He sat still for a moment and stared down at the shoulder straps on the frock coat before he dropped his watch into his waistcoat pocket. He picked up the frock coat and fingered the gold-embroidered insignia on the straps. There were 2 bars at either end of them now. A nurse had added her handiwork to the coat when the news of his promotion had come through to the hospital. He glanced to the honor sword leaning against the back of the open wardrobe and pictured perfectly the inscription on the hilt, though he'd been able to bring himself to read it only once. Teague Scott, Captain, U.S. Army, 1862. He wondered if he ought to wear it too, infernal nuisance though it was. Regulations would have required it, but the noise it would make a clanging against his crutches. He might as well make as much noise as he liked, though. People would stare at him anyway. They always did. Hang it all. He rubbed a hand over what was left of his leg, and though it didn't hurt this morning, he looked over to where his pill case lay on the dresser. He stood at Dr. Warner's knock on his door and quickly pulled on the uniform coat. He had the buttons started when Warner opened the door. The doctor stood silently once in the room. Teague looked up from the buttons and kept his eyes on his pill case as Warner picked it up from the dresser. He forced himself to breathe normally and attempted a smile. I suppose the horses are hitched. I'll be done presently. Teague lifted the sash from the bed. Teague, Annalie told me she couldn't wake you this morning. She keeps telling me I shouldn't write so late in the night. It scared her. That and how you acted after you fell with Lucy. Dr. Warner held up the pill case. How many did you take? Teague cleared his throat and swallowed. 3. Are you trying to kill yourself? Teague only stared at the crimson fibers of his sash. Because this will do the job. You take too many of these and you will stop breathing. Do you understand me? Teague nodded. Warner opened the case and emptied some of the pills into his hand. Teague looked up at the sound and breathed faster. I'm going to leave you enough for a week for now, and you can't come for more until next week. Why? Teague raised his voice. Warner raised his eyebrows. Why? 2 pills don't work. I can't just take 2. You don't know. Teague. Dr. Warner spoke deliberately. If it happens again, I will take all of them away. I'm not a child. Then don't act like one. Teague looked back down to the sash. Dr. Warner stood for a moment and cleared his own throat. I think you might be more comfortable in something else. He gestured to Teague's uniform. I'll, see if one of Tom's suits will do. Teague threw his sash back on the bed as Dr. Warner walked away. He closed his eyes and slumped down to the bed, then held his head in his hands. Hang everything. Monday, 8 July, 1861. My fears have been realized. While I can recall the regulations, book, chapter, and verse as I write now, Aubrey has repeatedly reminded me that when I went to the field this morning and faced my old schoolmates, the tactics flew from my mind. I do not remember exactly what I ordered, only that with each passing moment my face grew hotter and my mouth drier. Aubrey knows precisely what I did, and delights in telling me and anyone else he can of my blunder. I had divided the ranks to practice one of the more complicated maneuvers, and the first few commands had gone tolerably well. But the commands started to become jumbled in my mind, and before I knew anything was amiss, the men in rear of the second group had the first group coming headlong behind them at a double quick. They tried to quicken the step of their comrades in front by treading on their heels. The leaders of the first group tried to veer away from them, without a command from me, which put the rest of the ranks into confusion. Unfortunately, all of this reconfiguring resulted in a cascade of blue figures tumbling to the ground. Before I managed to force my voice to carry the order to halt to the ears of those farthest away, the company was in a jumble trying to avoid the pile of men 4 or 5 high in the middle of the field. I can only thank God no one has bayonets yet. Aubrey, of course, laughed at me in front of the men. A grand time is being had by all at my expense.